Good morning, everybody. Welcome. For those of you staying in the hotel, it's a smooth descent to the ballroom. For those of you who've been out in Adelaide traffic, it's a nightmare, but it's all for a good cause, the Clipsal 500. Thank you for coming to this session. It promises to be really fascinating. Our speaker this morning is Deanne Weir. Some of you will know her under some of the hats she wears. She's currently serving on the board of Screen Australia. She has a legal background. She was with Oz Stereo for some time. She's on various boards, and she runs investment funds. Well, Deanne will explain more about that. And she's here to talk to us about a crucial topic for our industry, how to sustain our businesses in this industry. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Deanne.
Thanks, Helen, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. Yes, there's sort of a question about, why on earth would anybody invest in an Australian production company? And my husband actually asked me that question when I told him that we were investing in Hoodlum. And probably the easiest way to answer the question is just to say passion, because if you actually applied some of the traditional investment metrics, as my husband unfortunately has a habit of doing it when he looks at our various investments. If you actually look at risk profiles and industry comparisons and historical returns and alternative options, then you might actually be tempted to run the other way. But I don't think that tells the whole story. I think it misses what is actually a really exciting opportunity in a very dynamic market for both production companies and for investors. But from my observations of the sector, it's actually sort of sometimes a case of, investors are from Mars and content makers are from Venus. And until our production sector can actually start using some of the same languages as investors, then it might be that the investment we've seen in the last few years might become the exception rather than the rule. In my view, I actually think that consolidation and increased outside investment is actually necessary to create a sustainable sector. And those producers who are willing to sort of get on board with that wave, I think they're going to have a much brighter future than those who don't. And there's some obviously really interesting examples of tie-ups in recent times. You've got Universal investing in Matchbox. You've got the Zapruder Cordell Jigsaw merger. Just last week, we saw David Haslington's Racket Uno announcing that they are investing in Northern Pictures. So why do I think that this is important, and what are some of the global factors that are impacting on our sector, and perhaps what could production companies be doing to position themselves well? These are the sorts of things that I want to just chat about for the next half an hour or so, and then we can hopefully open it up and have a bit of a discussion. But we might start by just sort of asking ourselves the question, what is sustainable? Because everyone talks about we need to have a sustainable sector, but maybe we should talk a little bit about what that might actually mean. And for some people, it might be as simple as being able to pay the staff wages without dipping into the mortgage account. Other people might measure it by the number of projects they do every year, or a particular level of profit margin. There was a really good report last year by Jonathan Olsberg from his consultancy, Olsberg SBI, which was actually looking at what was actually called building sustainable film businesses. And he gave a definition of sustainability as being where a business was actually investment ready. And that would mean that it had enough financial strength to attract private corporate finance, I guess, such as the investment that we've made into Hoodlum. And that's a nice idea, but it's actually not terribly realistic when you have a look at a lot of production companies and just how much public subsidy they actually rely on. So he sort of gave an alternative definition where he talked about maintained sustainability. And that relates to companies that, although they might not be investment ready in a traditional sense, they've actually been able to produce really high quality productions on a regular basis due to having consistent public sector support. If you want to look at profit margin, that's another measure. The Australian Bureau of Statistics did their screen industry survey in 2006-2007, and they found that the average operating profit margin of a film and video production sector business was about 8.8%, and that compared to 10.8% an average profit margin across all industries in the Australian economy. Now, the problem with a business running low margins, obviously, is it doesn't leave a lot of room for contingency. If things go wrong with a project, or if you have a lean period, and that probably describes for most of you in the room the last few years, you don't have much left in the pot to actually play with. Given the very high, from a business perspective, given the really high risk nature of the production sector, you would actually assume that it should actually have higher profit margins than average. But, everyone in this room knows that that's actually not the case. If we want to get a little bit more specific and drill down into actual production companies themselves, a great source of information is Screen Australia's 2010 business survey. And in fact, the most recent survey results will be out later in the year, but we'll stick with the 2010 results for the moment. The results of that survey suggested there were 394 active production companies in Australia at that time, and active meant having more than one project in the last 3 years. Most of those businesses specialise in one type of output, so 52% of them made documentaries only, and many of those only made one project per year. 23% made features only, 12% TV drama only, 13% of them were obviously doing a combination of all of the above. But what about business size and business structure, and who owns them? Asking the question about who owns a business is actually an important consideration for sustainability, because if you're a business that's part of a larger corporate group, you often have somewhere else to go for extra capital when times are tough. Well, not so much for our sector. 96% of the companies surveyed by Screen Australia in 2010 were owned by the founder. 13% of them had equity held by friends and family, and only 10% had any kind of professional private investment at all. 66% of them were limited liability companies, 24% sole traders. 91% had a turnover of less than $2 million. 75% had less than 10 employees, and only 10% had more than 50 staff. Due to the project nature of our industry, 64% of employees within these businesses are employed on a casual basis, and labour costs represent about 50% of total expenditure. In terms of where revenue actually comes from, 89% of screen sector businesses were generating income from a combination of sources, mostly producer fees or royalties. And in fact, producer fees actually represented about 47% of total income in 2009-2010. But that's actual income into the business. It's also really interesting, I think, to have a look at the source of funding for particular projects when we're actually talking about facts and figures. And if we have a look at independent documentaries, for the 5-year period to 2011-2012, on average, you can break up sources of finance for those projects as follows. So you've got about 13% coming from the producer offset, 16% from Screen Australia, 5% from state agencies, and then 66% from other. Now, the other category obviously includes the public and the commercial broadcasters, as well as foreign and other industry sources. There isn't a sort of specific breakdown available on an annual basis, but I can say in 2009-2010, the ABC and SBS, they contributed about 20% of total finance, and commercial broadcasters around 25%. If you compare that to feature films, for the 2011-2012 feature film slate, 10% of project funding came directly from government, 29% from producer offset, 3% from the private sector, 6% from industry, and 52% from foreign sources. And then finally, if we have a look at TV dramas for 2011-2012, you can see that sort of 10% of the funding came from government, 12% from producer offset, less than 1% from private investment, 62% obviously from the television networks, and then 16% from foreign investors. Now, when you look at all of the data that's out there, obviously a lot of the good news is that despite the impacts of the global financial crisis and despite a high Australian dollar, production levels are up. The quality of our television drama has never been better. Our movies are finding audiences and some commercial success, and the producer offset is doing what we hoped it would do. But the key characteristics of the sector are also really clear. We're dominated by small business, we're dominated by a casual workforce, but we also have passionate and creative people with a vision who set up shop and want to make a living telling stories. And many of those stories are funded to a very large extent by the taxpayer, whether that's by direct investment, by tax incentives, or by government-funded broadcasters. Now, for most players around the world outside of Hollywood and Bollywood, that's actually a very common story. But regardless of the passion and regardless of our ability to produce really fantastic stories, there are external factors at play, a lot of which we've already been talking about over the last few days, that are really impacting on the sustainability of the Australian production sector. And I think everybody needs to be, thinking about these factors and how that will impact their business. So, what are these changing dynamics and what should we be paying attention to? It's made clear if you look at 40,000-year-old cave paintings that one thing has not changed since the time of early humans, and that is our passion for telling stories. But the way in which we tell them has certainly changed, even since the story of the Kelly Gang in 1906, 3D and everything else. Changes in technology and ubiquitous high-speed broadband, again supported in Australia by the government's funding of the National Broadband Network. Those technological changes are absolutely changing and revolutionising every single point in the chain of development, production, distribution, marketing, exhibition, and just as importantly, consumption. And anyone who has a business in the production sector and the screen sector really needs to understand what the dynamics and what the changes are at every point of that chain, because it absolutely has a loop effect and impacts on the rest. Now, quite rightly, there's a lot of concern about how technology is facilitating piracy and about how the new platforms created by the new technologies are disturbing existing windows and business models. And that's all true. But there is no turning back the tide or putting the genie back in the bottle. So basically, we just have to simply embrace all of that change and really use it. And in my view, despite the challenges that the technological transformation is bringing, the overwhelming impact of all of this new technology is absolutely positive and transformative. Because if we choose to, we can tell our stories in a whole new way. If we choose to, we can tell our stories far more cheaply. And if we choose to, we can distribute our stories to the world using new distribution models and new business models as well. All of this requires new ways of thinking, of being prepared to challenge the status quo, and everybody needs to do it because everybody's cheese is being moved. First of all, funding models themselves are being constantly challenged, and particularly the reliance on direct government funding. While there are real signs that the producer offset is leading to an increase in production and an improvement in the position of producers, many films are still reliant on Screen Australia direct funding as well, and that is an issue. The bipartisan intent at the point of introducing the producer offset and creating Screen Australia out of the three former agencies was really quite clear that over time the positive benefit of the offset combined with other initiatives would mean a more sustainable sector would exist. And as a result, there's a very clear bipartisan intention that the allocation of funds to Screen Australia for direct investment will be reduced over time. Now, obviously, when those reforms were introduced in 2007, nobody quite foresaw the impact of the global financial crisis and how that might actually impact the timing of a move to sustainability. But, to be fair, the GFC has actually impacted all areas of the economy, and it will have a lasting impact on government revenues. So with all areas of government spending being impacted, it's pretty optimistic to assume that our sector is going to be able to be isolated and to receive increased funding. As a risk management exercise, basically everybody needs to assume that there will be less direct funding coming into the sector over time, and we need to actually think through the implications of that. And that's actually why the concept of sustainability is so important. Although people don't often like to hear it, the fact is that not many other sectors in the Australian economy, other than perhaps the car industry, receive such a level of government investment and protection, whether it's by way of direct production investment or regulatory, the incredible regulatory protection that's provided to free-to-air networks, or indeed government funding of ABC and SBS, who are obviously the key funders and commissioners of a lot of documentary content. During the 2010-2011 financial year, the Australian government provided over $1.3 billion in support to entities related to the screen sector. Obviously, nearly $90 million to Screen Australia, 25 to the NFSA, 24 to AFTRS, nearly $3 million to ACTF, etc. You can see the numbers up there. And then, of course, you've got the $956 million to the ABC and $211 million to SBS. In addition to that, of course, you've also got the $128 million in producer offset that was paid out in 2010 and 2011, and that actually grew to $204 million in 2011-12. So whilst everyone recognises the struggle that a lot of participants in the sector face, the fact is we are actually sitting at the centre of one of the most supported and protected sectors of the Australian economy. Now, before anybody starts getting annoyed, I should point out that I actually believe a significant level of government investment in and support for the production sector is a totally necessary and good thing. We can always argue about how that protection is provided and to whom, about what the incentives are and about how the mechanisms work. But in a globalised world, it's absolutely critical that we facilitate the making, the telling and the distribution of Australian stories. We continue to really punch above our weight in the global, in terms of our global influence in the media sector. But the fact is our lack of scale and the sheer force and momentum of the Hollywood machine, the mass availability of non-Australian content in an era of ubiquitous internet, this all means that we need to be innovative and aggressive in how we ensure our voices and our stories are heard. But I do have a concern that sometimes the weight of all of those challenges tends to lead us to reach automatically for the drug of government subsidy rather than seizing the entrepreneurial opportunity that might be there. And it's that spirit of entrepreneurialism that's really critical in what is such a dynamic and changing environment. Now, there's no doubt that there's bipartisan political recognition about the critical importance of the screen sector to our national identity, and it's absolutely accepted that the screen sector is a really significant employer, innovator and skills developer. And I think most politicians are also clear about the impact that screen productions can have on our tourism and our export earnings, and indeed our own domestic economy by way of the multiplier effect. But despite all of this, the cold hard facts are that in a world of challenged economic circumstances and technological transformation, of arguments over deficits versus surpluses, there can be no guarantees around the level of direct or indirect government funding for our sector. And frankly, there also can't be any guarantees around the future makeup of or funding for the public broadcasters. And these are the sorts of things that we need to think about when we're involved in screen businesses. We also need to be clear about just how significant the changes are that are impacting on the Australian television sector. For the half year to December 31, metropolitan free-to-air ad revenues were down 3.8% compared to the previous period, which was down on the period before that. Ad revenues are in structural decline. It is not just a case of a few bad years. Digital switchover will be complete this year, permanently removing the distinction between main channels and digital channels, forever splitting eyeballs and challenging free-to-air's ability to aggregate mass audiences at any one point in time. Despite all of that ongoing regulatory protection given to the free-to-airs, their commercial model is definitely challenged. The days of regularly achieving 2 million or more viewers for any particular program are well behind us. And as Channel 9's Adrian Swift put it the other day, 1 million is the new 2 million. At the same time, Foxtel's growth is also stalled and its competitive landscape is being transformed, as the introduction of the NBN will help to facilitate new IPTV competitors who might have much lower priced and much more flexible packages. Services like Apple TV are now readily available, providing more and more choice for people who are happy to pay for their entertainment, while YouTube is making massive amounts of video content available for free. And YouTube is a global platform that is transforming how people interact with content, and I think this is actually a really exciting opportunity for content producers. Anyone can actually go online and set up their own YouTube channel, and by doing so, you can generate ad revenue against ads that appear against your content. It might not pay the mortgage, but it's definitely something, and it's a way of getting your content distributed. There are now thousands of channels that actually make more than 6 figures every year in YouTube revenue alone. And importantly, it's actually also a way of putting your content out there, but also protecting it. If you use YouTube's Content ID service, they apply their technology against your content files, and then their system recognises if someone else, like a fan, actually uploads your content. You can then choose to either block the fan uploaded content, you can track it and be provided with statistics about its use, or you can choose to monetise it by gaining a share of ad revenue that is earned against that content. And, you know, we've all seen how fans love to upload content to YouTube and how that can actually be a fantastic viral marketing tool. And this process really allows you to turn those fans into marketers and distributors of your content while you've got an opportunity to generate some revenue. And it's also interesting to see how YouTube's working with global brands and accomplished content makers to launch premium YouTube channels. The top 1% of those channels, which is around 900 from all around the world, they are each generating more than 4 million views per month. And while their revenue model is advertising, YouTube actually facilitates ad skipping, so the only people who watch the ads are those who are interested enough to actually have a look at them, which drives deeper engagement. As of last year, when comparing the revenue per hour for YouTube's skippable ads in the US, so this is just US alone, those ads on YouTube were making just as much money per hour from advertising as all of the US cable networks combined. So as of last October, 800 million unique users were watching 4 billion hours of video every month on YouTube, and 70% of that traffic was coming from outside of the US. So it's a transformative platform that really can't be ignored. And to that point, major companies like Shine and Fremantle have bought companies who've launched premium channels on YouTube. Rumour is that some of those players will be part of YouTube's rumoured launch of subscription channels, raising the prospect that those production companies are going to go over the top of the television networks and direct to the consumer via YouTube. So this is a really fascinating space to watch. Now, not surprisingly, all of this is having a really major impact on audience behaviour. People are simply not prepared to be held to someone else's timetable. They will watch what they want to watch, when they want to watch it, on the device they want to watch it on. And if content providers won't meet the audience at least halfway and facilitate that behavioural change, then they risk becoming irrelevant. Audiences are no longer passive consumers of content presented from on high. They're making their views known instantly via social media tools, and that can have a huge impact on the perception of programming from the minute it goes to air, or indeed sometimes even before. Importantly, advertisers are all over all of these behavioural and technological changes, and they are insisting on much more detailed and precise measurement of audience activity and engagement. Advertisers want real and engaged audiences, and as they chase all of those eyeballs, they're changing how and where they spend their ad dollars. And that is what's having the impact back on free-to-air networks and the structural decline that we're seeing there. In my view, analysing these business trends and understanding what's going on in the broader market is critical for any production company. If you don't have those skills, then you need to work with somebody who does. Any business person needs to really think about what their clients and stakeholders, about what is important to them, what is impacting their business models, their financials. And by better understanding your clients, you've got obviously much better hope of being able to sell them a product. By better understanding all of your stakeholders, you've got much more hope that those stakeholders will provide you the support that you need for your endeavours. Now, if someone is coming from a more artistic, journalistic or cultural perspective, some of this talk about product and market might really great, but as a business person, it actually defies logic for me that someone would consider asking somebody else, whether it's the taxpayer, an investor or another business, to give them money to pursue their endeavour without thinking about what the impact is in the market for that product. For the Australian production sector to thrive, its participants have to continue to think more like real businesses and less like a cottage industry. And I still believe that despite specific challenges faced by documentary makers, I would still say this absolutely applies to them as well. The Jonathan Olsberg report that I referred to before put it really nicely, I think, when it concluded that in the future, owners or managers of film businesses need to think of themselves not as people who make great films, but as people who run businesses that make great films. But hang on a minute, I hear a few of you saying, I can read it on your faces, it's not as easy as that. The production sector obviously has unique challenges and this is more of an art than a science. Normal business rules can't always apply. And of course, I agree with that to a certain extent. In the content business, it's really difficult to judge demand. To know the answer to that puzzle of all puzzles, will an audience like my story? But like any business, there are means of mitigating that uncertainty. Depending on the funding model for a particular project, other people might be wearing a degree of that risk for you. The television network who pays for the project, limiting your risk to upside opportunity. The distributor that pays in advance. The taxpayer who helps to fund the project. As you work in partnership with those different players, you really owe it to them to be as prepared and as knowledgeable as possible because, to use a cliche, knowledge is power. So, step number one is actually asking some questions. And let's start with the ultimate stakeholder, the audience. What do audiences want to see? What are they challenged by? Do some research about trends, what's being considered the next big thing. If there is a passion within you for a particular kind of content that you want to make, have a look around at where the audience is for that content. And documentary is actually a great example of where audiences have been shifting around. As someone who spent a very long time in the pay TV sector, and so I spent 10 years at Ozstar, it's been great in the last few years to see our documentary community really start to understand the power of pay television and its documentary channels. Commercial free-to-air networks, they're interested in factual entertainment because that's what their audiences are enjoying, and frankly, the business model works for them as well. They are not particularly interested anymore in more traditional documentary form because that doesn't work with their audience. It's a simple business proposition. Relative to the commercial networks, the ABC and SBS are more interested in traditional forms of documentary, partly because of the funding that's available under the National Documentary Program to fund them, and partly because they are relevant to their charters. But as their funding models continue to change and as audience tastes and behaviour continues to change, they are more likely to want to see series of documentaries rather than one-offs. Now, and I know this issue has been a significant matter of debate and it's a real matter of concern to a lot in the documentary community who've seen that change happen perhaps over sort of the last 5 years. And I think it's a really appropriate topic for debate in the context of ABC and SBS charters. But at the end of the day, public broadcaster, commercial broadcaster, pay broadcaster, audience drives investment. And just how much ratings should be influencing the national broadcasters, that's a really relevant debate to be had. But in a changing landscape, all broadcasters are trying to work out how to remain relevant. And along the way, mistakes are going to be made. But the best way to be part of that debate and to be part of that decision-making process is to really understand what's driving the broadcaster views. Because unless you can find other sources of finance or other distribution models, then they're the people that you're actually selling your content to. That brings me back to the pay TV channels. And look, if you're an Australian documentary maker and you don't know Jim Buchan of Foxtel or Karen Simoncini at Nat Geo, Mandy Pattinson at Discovery or Deirdre Brennan at the BBC, then you really, really should. Apart from the fact that they're all lovely people, they are commissioning interesting material, but they are also a gateway to an entire international network of documentary exhibitors. And a great example of this is Luke Pike, who's an Adelaide producer who pitched his documentary idea, Abalone Wars, to Discovery via its Ignite program. It got through the program and got up. It premiered on Discovery Australia, New Zealand last year, and this year is going to be seen on Discovery US and then all over the world on Discovery International. Now, if you have a chance to work with any of these folks, they are going to be all over you in terms of what you're producing, how it will work with their audience, and how it fits with their channel brand. And frankly, so they should, because it's their money. So the network that you're working with is just as important a stakeholder as the audience. So work out how any project you're pitching would actually fit with the network's current and future slate. How does it suit their brand? If it's a commercial network, have a look at who their key advertising partners are. Would your project be attractive to any of those partners? Storm Surfers 3D is actually a fantastic example of a recent Australian documentary that worked hard on all levels for its stakeholders, for the audience, for the network, and for its advertisers. Beyond the film itself, the producers created a fantastic multi-platform world that really deepened the experience for the audience and actually created great opportunities for advertisers, all without compromising in any way entertainment values or the integrity of the work. Now, a final group of stakeholders to talk about are the investors themselves. Having a network fund a television project on a case-by-case basis is one thing, but obviously if your distribution model is cinema or online, you actually need some cash to keep food on the table. And if you want to avoid some of the cash flow dramas that come with the project-by-project funding model, maybe you want an investor to actually invest directly in your business. But again, this is where you need to speak in their language and not just in yours. So why might somebody invest? Well, there are a million reasons why someone might choose to invest in an Australian production business, and perhaps we can start with why I chose to invest in Hoodlum, which is one of the 5 media-related companies that our investment company has an interest in. I started out as a lawyer, but 2 of my main passions have always been business and stories. So spending 10 years as a senior exec in the paid TV sector at Austar was a really great opportunity for me to combine those passions. The sale of Austar to Foxtel last year created an opportunity for me to launch my new career as a media entrepreneur, investing in a range of businesses. And I invest in companies where I see an opportunity for growth, for creating something really meaningful, and importantly, for having a lot of fun. And while I was at Austar, I spent a lot of time trying to understand what television audiences are interested in, and particularly what would interest them enough to continue to pay a monthly subscription for that content. I also served on the boards of Nickelodeon, XYZ Networks and Showtime, and combined with the last 5 years on the Screen Australia board, I guess I've been able to really deepen my understanding of the production sector and the challenges that it faces. I've known Tracy Robertson and Nathan Mayfield at Hoodlum for over 10 years. Their breakthrough production, Fat Cow Motel, was actually commissioned by Austar back in 2001. And we'd kept in touch, and I was actually providing some informal mentoring to Tracy as as an extension, I guess, of the Screen Australia Enterprise program. And they'd asked me to sort of become involved in the business. So I had to have a bit of a think about the implications of directly investing in a production company. But when I looked at Hoodlum as a business, all of the key ingredients are there for me. It is a great team, it has a great track record, it's got some very significant intellectual property, and a really great focus on running their company as a business. They understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they are really clear where they need additional expertise or advice. They look at how they can actually build equity value in the company, and on the need for diversity of slate and on risk management. They focus on return on investment and growth opportunities, but they're also focused on ensuring that the projects they work on are really suited to them and their team, rather than doing a project just because they're there. And most importantly, they never stand still. While they continue to hone their skills as producers of quality television, they have been world leaders in multi-platform production, continually deepening their understanding of how stories can be told using new technologies and new platforms. And they're now continuing that evolution by looking at how brands, producers, networks and platforms can all work together to create entertaining content that really delivers results for the audience and every other stakeholder. I think that knowing who you are and what your purpose is as a business is absolutely critical to success, and that is very much what Hoodlum are focused on. Now, whether Hoodlum turns out to be a successful investment for my husband and I will obviously, that only time will tell, but I'm certainly having a massive amount of fun so far, so it ticks that box for me. But perhaps we should end by talking about what success might look like. Because bottom line is, the best time to ever look for investment is when you are doing well and you want to use that investment to continue to grow. Seeking investment when your back is against the wall and when cash is really crunched is unfortunately always going to be a recipe for unhappy outcomes. So what might success look like? Following Screen Australia's 2010 business survey, they did some analysis of the results. And that analysis revealed a really clear correlation between two important indicators: consistency of work and profitability. Consistent businesses were much more likely than intermittent ones to have earned a profit, see 69% versus 46%, and profitable businesses were much more likely than unprofitable ones to have worked consistently. Those consistent and profitable businesses also shared a number of characteristics that really contributed to their success. First of all, teamwork. These companies, the consistent and the profitable ones, were much more likely to have collaborated with other businesses or producers. They tended to engage in more joint ventures, and they were more likely to have multiple producers. Second, in regard to their actual activity, their businesses were more likely to have slates that included more than one production type. They didn't appear to actually do a significantly different range of activities other than content creation, but they were much more likely to be involved in new media. In regard to income and employment, they were more likely to earn over $2 million a year and less likely to earn under $500, and they were obviously, as a result, likely to have more employees. And they were more likely to earn income from producer fees and royalties, and obviously to have accessed the producer offset. In looking at their business assets and tools, they were more likely to use tools such as a dedicated website, a formal business plan, to actually have a formal board of directors and a line of credit. They might have an equity share in other businesses, an annual marketing spend of over $200,000, which wasn't related to a specific project, and they were definitely based outside of home. And finally, those businesses are all about audience engagement, being much more likely to have produced a title that reached $1 million at the Australian box office, or more than 1 million viewers on free-to-air in the last 5 years. Now, thankfully for me, Hoodlum in various ways ticks pretty much all of those boxes. When talking about successful companies, it's also interesting to have a look at the companies in Screen Australia's Enterprise program and the results they've been generating. I think, as you know, the Enterprise program provided funding over a 3-year period to a range of screen businesses who had identified development and expansion opportunities that would actually help increase their sustainability. And clearly, increasing consistency and profitability are all part of that sustainability story. For the first group of enterprise... Oh, whoops. Okay, well, there's a really lovely slide there that you can't see. And what that slide tells you is that for the first group of enterprise companies that started to receive funding in 2009, they saw an average 59% increase in projects in production and a 64% increase in the hours in production over the 3-year period of their participation in the enterprise program. For the second group of companies who started receiving funding in 2010, they've seen an average 38% increase in projects in production and a 218% increase in hours in production over their funding period. So these sorts of companies, which are able to show a consistent level of work and a path to profitability, are far more likely to be candidates for external investment. The level of cooperation they exhibit with other producers may also be an opportunity to explore merger opportunities if both parties think that the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. Now, obviously, there are implications for inviting other players into your front door. It's not realistic to think that someone will invest money and then just walk away and leave you to it. While they might have complete faith in your creativity, and indeed you might ask why they would invest in you if they didn't, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be sitting at the table. Look at what benefits they could bring you. It might be business expertise, it might be connections, it might be strategic skills, but whatever it is, look for someone who can bring something more than just cash. Look for someone who can bring skills that complement yours, and then be prepared to be totally transparent and open with those investors. You might feel a certain loss of control and you might feel a little bit uncomfortable being questioned on certain things, but really, sometimes having to articulate why you do things in a certain way is a really great reality check and a chance to continually improve. Now, if you don't want to work with people in that way, that is absolutely fine too, but then you need to be realistic about how you're going to fund your projects and your company, and you need to cut your coat according to your cloth and work within those constraints. Teaming up with other production companies, perhaps in a more informal way, is also a great way to share costs, to get access to additional expertise and get a different perspective on your project. There will still, of course, be trade-offs, certain loss of control, sharing of potential upside, and the need to take into account other people's views. Now, from a documentary maker's perspective, I appreciate that some documentary makers work in a much more solitary mode, relentlessly pursuing a subject that's of passionate interest and often of great social importance. If that's you, then, perhaps you need to think about other sources of finance that would work for you. First, there's obviously Screen Australia's signature fund that doesn't require broadcast attachment. That fund's recently been increased by $500,000, so there's up to $2 million a year available each year for bold and innovative documentary projects, whether they're produced for the big screen as iDocs, online productions, or as multi-platform experiences. You might also try crowdfunding, platforms such as Possible or Fan Dependent, which was started by Luke Pomerantz and Thomas May, and that's actually being supported by Screen Australia's Innovative Distribution Fund. And Gaby Baby, one of the films that is part of the Opening Shot 2 program, that's being supported by the Fan Dependent platform as well. In addition to crowdfunding, you could also consider whether or not your project is one that would be appropriate for philanthropic support via the wonderful Documentary Australia Foundation. Now, just to declare an interest here, I've recently joined the DAF Leadership Council, and via DAF, my foundation, the Weir Anderson Foundation, is actually supporting Rebecca Barry's upcoming film, I Am a Girl. Donors who support DAF projects are not investors in the traditional sense. They are people who believe in the power of documentary to inform, inspire, facilitate debate, and affect social change. The return they're looking for is being part of that process and part of social change outcomes, they're not really looking for a bottom line financial return. So even if your project has difficulty raising finance from traditional sources, DAF may well be an alternative market door on which to knock. And even though they're not traditional investors, DAF and any donors should be treated as key stakeholders. They are well connected, they can be a source of great support that goes far beyond the financial. And they will, of course, be interested in much more than just the content on the screen. They're likely to want to see the power of the story extended beyond its screen presence into online, into educational outreach, into activities that can multiply the power and impact of that screen content. The issue of funding for long-form one-off Australian documentaries is, I think, a subject of debate at every single AIDC, and I'm sure it will continue to be so. It just may be the case that because of the size of our market and that this sector of the industry will never, ever be commercially sustainable. That just might be a fact of life. If so, it obviously reinforces the need for continued government funding, but it perhaps also signals the need for a not-so-new model to be pursued. Throughout the centuries, artists have been supported by patrons who believe in truth and beauty and perhaps want a well-decorated villa in Tuscany. But Australia is actually a very, very wealthy country, and we have a lot of people with high disposable income who are interested in art, who are interested in truth, and who are very interested in social issues. So whether it's via DAF or via a more direct relationship between such people and filmmakers, perhaps we need to start selling the investment proposition a little bit differently. Investing in quality documentaries is not necessarily about financial return, but it's about social impact and social return. And perhaps part of the answer is to try and find a language that connects the passion of filmmakers with the interests of people who have got money to invest in social change, in finding those patrons of the 21st century. Personally, for all of the difficulties, I am extremely excited about the future of the production industry. Australians have shown their passion for Australian stories, and the digital revolution is opening the door to telling our stories in bold new ways and getting much closer to our audiences. Our challenge is to be open to those innovations and to make the most of them. And I'm certainly looking forward to being part of the sector for many years to come. Thank you. Now we have got a little bit of time for some questions, but as you know, it's being recorded, so if you'd like to ask a question, please use the microphone. Gentleman in the front.
Pat Ferns, this is less a question than a promotion. We are continuing this discussion about sustainability in a session at 11:45 called Big Fish, Small Fish or School, and we're going to have a number of people who've been going through the business of how they're going to achieve sustainability as Australian production companies. We've got a great panel, so I hope you'll come and be able to continue it. But thank you, Deanne, for that analysis. It was terrific.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
Just a question about, I suppose, culture versus commerce, and particularly with Screen Australia, because there's been a trend to go from a more cultural base to a commercial base, it seems, in programming and the enterprise scheme. And with the government not wanting to take the convergence review on and also dumping the national cultural policy, we hope not, I'm a bit more pessimistic about the future, certainly in terms of the government interaction with the industry and certainly with the smaller players in the industry. So I wonder if is there a view within Screen Australia that we should always be moving away from a cultural remit towards, which it seems to be, towards a commercial remit?
Well, no, look, I think the fact is we have both remits, and the enterprise program is about trying to actually focus on that sustainability focus, which hopefully will have dividends from a cultural perspective as well, because the more sustainable Australian businesses we have, the more Australian stories that we're telling. But it doesn't take away from the cultural remit as well. And look, our challenge at Screen Australia is to try and get that balance right in an era of shrinking funds. And, we've been able to maintain the level of direct investment thus far that we've been putting into documentary, but that's sort of been achieved with the amalgamation of the three agencies. We've actually reduced operating costs 40%, and I think the management team, Ruth and the team, have done an amazing job on being able to achieve that over the sort of 4 or so year period. But nobody should think that the cultural remit is any less important, but as I'm sort of trying to suggest in this presentation, there's a reality factor of reduced direct funding over time. And, you know, our challenge is to choose between the children. And it's a really difficult path, but one that I think, you know, we would like to think that we're actually still trying to get that balance right between culture and actual sustainability.
Because I would agree. Hello? I would agree with you about, you know, we need to find another way to finance, but I suppose what I'm also concerned about is that the cultural, I mean, Lee Tarbett, who's just written a paper about culture, is suggesting that, you know, really culture is not put on the same platform as education, which maybe it should be, which it's always about, oh, we're giving all this money to stuff because it's, you know, the attitude is against the idea of culture being of value to the society that we live in. So it is of concern, I think, that, you know, the bigger picture is that that's being pushed to the side, that everything has to have an economic value, not a cultural value. And the cultural value, and this is coming across at the broadcasters as well, in light of the argument that obviously I'm from the ADG have had about the series versus the individual documentaries, where the diversity is being lost because of that economic argument and a ratings argument, which, by the way, is a furphy because the single docs rate just as well. But that's the same argument, and it's a concern. It seems to be crossing over. So that I won't say any more, but that's...
Yeah, no, I think the broadcasters, there's an interesting ongoing discussion to be had there with the broadcasters. Yes, there's just down the back there.
Hi, thanks. That was a great presentation. The way I see things at the moment is that cable's helping define the new mainstream, whereas free-to-air was defining an old mainstream, and we're seeing in both sort of more and more hybrid documentaries and things like that. The online media seems to me to be opening up a lot of niche markets, and in that context, I think traditional documentaries have a lot of potential to come back, along with a whole range of other things. What's your view on that?
Look, I think the whole online, the beauty of the online world when you talk about niches is that they're global niches, and that is actually an incredible opportunity. You know, when we talk about the challenge of Australian long-form documentary, the concern might be if it's a very specifically Australian topic, you know, that it won't actually translate. I think most themes are in fact universal, even if their application is sort of specific to, and I think maybe there's a challenge in that, which is to find a way to tell that story, but look for that more universal appeal, which then the whole online world gives you that opportunity. And whether it's a distribution opportunity or it's a marketing opportunity, there are ways of creating social universes around particular issues and content that can actually amplify the effect of any particular piece of content. And I think that's really a great opportunity. Perhaps time for one more question here.
Hi, Deanne. That was fantastic analysis. Thank you. I mean, direct government funding really is there to meet market failure, and I'd just like to interrogate this idea a little bit more around profitability, because if we go back to the charts from the 2010 survey, where 19% of income for documentaries was derived from distribution rights and royalties, and then you look at the feature graph, there was no indication of a percentage return from distribution rights or royalties as making up income. What does profitability actually really mean, and particularly to a private investor in this sector? Yeah,
look, very good question, because it actually, a lot of it comes back to the structural elements of it. You know, are you investing directly into a company, or are you investing into a project? And there's a difference between the two. You know, I would say that my investment in a production company, I'm not expecting that to be the most profitable ever of my investments, but it's actually, it's about perhaps a future of building equity in that business over time. So I think this is actually part of the issue. You have to step back and have a look at what a particular investor is interested in at a particular point in time. And I actually think that there may well be an opportunity that we're missing here for private investment in both feature film in projects, but also then in businesses per se. You know, the film business is really sexy. And you guys, you're sexy. You may not actually get this, but compared to a lot of other stuff that people are able to invest in, you're sexy and interesting because it's all about the film. You've got to play up that sexiness a bit, and also you've got the social benefit that we've been talking about as well. You've got, for larger businesses, you know, the fact is the younger generation who are coming in as grads now do want to see, if they're going to work for a larger corporate, they're interested in what are you doing as a social tool. Well, investing in Australian culture is actually something that younger people might find particularly interesting, and so there's sort of, I think we've got a range of levers that we can pull here for potential investors if we think a little bit more creatively about it.
And maybe one of the things we can be looking at is demonstrating ongoing sources of revenue rather than getting caught up in notions of profitability. It's actually demonstrable sources of revenue in an ongoing sense. And that's certainly one of the things we'll be talking about in the session this afternoon, the never-ending tale.
And I think, but that also comes down to having a very well articulated business plan about actually articulating what the diversified sources of revenue are, and perhaps getting away from just a project by project analysis, and being able to show that you, as a business, rather than just working on one project after another, you are looking for diversified revenue streams. All right, look, I think we have to finish up. So thank you very much, and see you later on.